With the Melbourne Marathon, it's a couple of staff members at Wesley College are running this morning, the whole 42 kilometres, and I admire them for their commitment and the practice. I often think it would be great if people put as much energy into developing their spiritual life as well as their physical life. And with the decline in numbers in our churches, I guess someone said the only time people are on their knees today is when they're looking for their contact lenses. Our topic today is thinking about myths and symbols and how they are so important in nurturing our lives and faith. Many of you would be familiar, of course, with the writings of Rollo May. And in his great book, The Cry for Myth, he says that myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. Myths are narrative patterns that give significance to our existence. And whether the meaning of existence is only what we put into life by our own individual fortitude, as Paul Sartre would suggest, or whether there is a meaning that we need to discover, as Soren Kierkegaard would state, the result is the same. Myths are our way of finding this meaning and significance in our lives. We know that in ancient Greece, for example, when myths were vital and strong, individuals were able to meet the challenges of life without overwhelming anxiety or feelings of guilt. And as a result, philosophers from that time were able to write about and to discuss beauty, truth, goodness, and courage as integral values of human life. The myths gave philosophers such as Plato and Sophocles the freedom to create their philosophical writings and literary works, of which, of course, we have access to today. But as Lucretius has reminded us in his writings, when the myths of ancient Greece broke down in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there was aching hearts in every room and home, racked incessantly by pangs the mind was powerless to assuage. Is this a picture then of many people and their lives today? Many of our myths no longer serve their function in making sense of our existence. Many people who experience a lack of direction or purpose in life find themselves in a swamp of anxiety and guilt. Is it any wonder then that people flock to psychotherapists, counsellors, psychologists and psychiatrists, or self-medicate themselves to try to hold themselves together? Don't get me wrong, of course. Seeking help from professional people may be a very constructive way of seeking to assuage some of our modern ills. But the psychologist Jerome Bruner once wrote, "When the prevailing myths fail to fit the varieties of our plight in life, frustration expresses itself in an attack on myths and then in the lonely search for internal identity." Perhaps what Brunner was trying to say was that if we diminish or lose the presence of myths in our lives, those stories which undergird basic human values and provide us with our mega narratives in life, or if we are unable to connect with the transcendent, which of course is what myths are about, then we embark on an interior search for identity, and hence the development, since Freud, of course, of psychotherapy. Let us for a moment then think about a couple of examples of ancient myths. I read one of them this morning from Genesis. Whenever a new period of human history emerges, people change their ideas of both humanity and divinity. In ancient Mesopotamia, when towns and cities began to be built, the gods seemed more remote from human activity and endeavour, because humans had more control over their environments and lives. So the mythology of the flood marked a crisis in divine human relationships. We are aware, of course, that the biblical flood story is one of many flood stories from the ancient world. In the Mesopotamian flood poem called Trahasis, the story goes that the minor gods went on strike, exhausted by digging to make the countryside more livable. So the mother goddess created human beings to do the manual labour. But they became too numerous and noisy. So the storm god, who is kept awake by all of this noise, decides to flood the world as a brutal method of population control. But the mother goddess wants to save Trahasis because he is a very wise and righteous man. So Atrahasis is instructed to build a boat and therefore save his family and the seeds of all living things. Does this story sound familiar? We all know that a creation story which we find in Genesis 1 and 2 was never intended to provide people with factual information about the origins of life. In the ancient world, as Karen Armstrong points out in her little book, creation stories were usually recited in a liturgical setting when people felt the need for an exposure to divine energy. The aim of a creation story was not to inform people, but was primarily therapeutic. People would listen to the recitation of the creation myth when they faced impending disaster or needed healing or relief from some trouble in their lives. It is interesting that in the poetry of the story of Job, for those of you who have read that ancient book, after Job had questioned God about what had happened to him and all of the disasters that had occurred in his life, the writer has God reciting the liturgy of creation to Job. Listen to what it says. Then God answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the world?" You can almost hear God, this image of God, saying to Job, "Where were you when I did all of this?" You know, in a sense, putting him back in his place. And if you look through chapter 38 of Job, you will find references to the earth being created, to the sea, to the dawn, to the deep, to light and darkness, the constellations of the stars, to clouds and water. In the myth then of the Garden of Eden, the word Eden in Hebrew means delight or a place of delight. Our English word paradise comes from a Persian word which means a walled enclosure. So in the story, when the first humans were driven out from the garden, 2 cherubims were stationed at its eastern gate to guard against them returning into this walled enclosure. Many of you here today, and I certainly have visited the ancient city of Nara, and I've been there probably 6 or 7 times. And it is one of the most important Buddhist centres in the world. Inside the world's biggest wooden building is an immense bronze statue of the Buddha. Its little finger, because he holds up his hand like this in the sign of peace, his little finger I'm as tall as his little finger. That gives you an idea of the size of the statue. It's 14.5 metres tall, or 53 feet in the old measurement. And as you approach the precincts of this temple, you pass through a gate that is guarded left and right by two gigantic, threatening military figures flourishing swords. One has their mouth open and the other has their mouth closed. As an example, I think of how we experience our world in pairs of opposites, like the yin and the yang. These are the Buddhist examples of the cherubim stationed by Yahweh at the garden gate of paradise. However, we're not to be afraid of these guardians. The fear of death and the desire for life aroused by these guardsmen are to be left behind us as we pass through this gate. In the Buddhist understanding of life, what is keeping us out of the garden is not the wrath of any god, but our own attachment to our own lives as we are experiencing them. And according to this understanding, we don't need a cherub with a flaming sword to keep us out of our inward garden. We keep ourselves out through our preoccupation with the temporal and mortal aspects of ourselves and our world. The imagery of which I've been speaking, of course, is older than the Old Testament, older than Buddhism from the 6th century before Christ, and older even than the ancient stories that come to us from the Hindu faith in India. For we find the symbolism of the serpent, the tree, and the garden of immortality already written down in the earliest cuneiform Sumerian texts. I find it interesting that Carl Jung makes the point that irrespective of differences in culture or consciousness, there is what he calls a collective unconsciousness that explains why there are so many of the same symbols and mythological motives to be found in various parts of the world. I remember on one time in India going into a very ancient Indian temple, and there the fresco on the wall was the creation story exactly in the same pattern and order as we have it in the book of Genesis. And these frescoes were thousands of years old. So how can attention to myths and symbols nurture our faith? Primitive people did not invent myths, they experienced them, they lived them, Jung says. Myths were original revelations of the preconscious psyche. Last week I spoke a little bit about the time that I spend in the Kimberleys with our Aboriginal friends. Think about their basic group of stories which constitute their psychic life. They're called the Dreamtime stories. And I've had the privilege of sitting in caves in the Kimberleys with Aboriginal elders where they have sung their Dreamtime stories handed down from generation to generation upon generation. A people or a tribe disintegrates or falls to pieces when it loses its mythological heritage. We have watched as the first peoples of this land, through various government policies, from the original dispossession of the land to the stolen generation and so on, we have been witness to a people who have become lost as they've been separated through various activities and policies of government. They've lost that connection with their stories. And as Carl Jung says, a tribe's mythology is its living religion, whose loss is always and everywhere, even among civilised people, a moral catastrophe. So without myths, There is no link with the past and no basis for orientation toward the future. We are indeed lost. If we consider our own society today, perhaps that is part of the experience of being lost that people have in their lives, in their search for a meaning and purpose, in their search for a faith that can bring to us joy and resilience, in our search for belonging and significance, for that feeling that we really matter to people and to ourselves in life. So we need to connect again to the great stories of our faith, the myths, the mega-narratives that undergird all human experience. I like the way Marcus Borg, for those of you who are familiar with his writings, approaches biblical stories in his book, Reading the Bible for the First Time. And he has this statement, which I think is very pertinent. He says that when he's reading biblical stories, he often says to people, "This story probably never happened, but it is still true. This story probably never happened, but it is still true." The final aspect of myths that I'd like to say this morning is that one of the functions of myth is that they help us to connect with each other. Myths help individuals to feel that they belong. And it was in the stories and myths of their culture that ancient people found how they were to live. And of course, over time, myths can become out of date, no longer relevant in the enlarged world in which we live. And the people of ancient Israel in exile asked themselves this question when they were separated from their land and temple: how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Could their God, Yahweh, be worshipped hundreds of kilometres away from the promised land and his temple that was destroyed? The world's great religions are those that are able to transcend the concrete, localised expression of their interpretation of the truth. And in exploring our own new faith, the challenge will be to develop new stories, new myths that will provide us with the psychic energy, the experience of belonging, and the sense of a larger reality that is beyond us all.